working as hard as they can to keep people that they will never know safe from harm. And the FBI that I see is reflected in folks like the
committee will reconvene. When the committee recessed, we were in the questioning period with the director of the FBI, and the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Handel, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Director Wray. Thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to see you. And I would just like to say that given your distinguished and exemplary record of service throughout your career, I frankly am on the extraordinarily optimistic side that under your leadership, we really will see a heightened degree of integrity going forward in the agency. So I look forward to that. I wanted to ask a couple of questions around terrorism and ISIS. You mentioned in your opening testimony that the agency has some 1,000 active terrorism-related investigations. How is that volume of terrorism investigative cases continuing or not continuing to strain the agency in terms of resources and your breadth of being able to cover other investigations?
It's a good question. We, in addition to those 1,000 ISIS-related investigations, we have, probably a closely similar number of what we would classify as homegrown violent extremists, which we would define as not so much ISIS-directed, but ISIS-inspired. People, lone wolves here who see sermons and videos and things like that and decide they want to act. And then, of course, we have quite a fair number still, even now in 2017, of Al-Qaeda-related investigations, Hezbollah-related investigations, and a number of other terrorist groups. And then that's not even talking about the domestic terrorism investigations. So our Counterterrorism Division and our JTTFs, our Joint Terrorism Task Forces around the country, are extremely busy. We have, I think, matured to a point where we're not having to re-divert agents from the more traditional criminal programs, except in rare situations where there's a sudden attack or something, and then we'll surge. But there's no question that we are spread very thin. And we're doing the best we can with what we have. I said to somebody recently, everywhere I turn in the country, I find people who want the FBI to do more of something. And I have yet to find the person who has identified something they want the FBI to do less of, but I'd love to someday.
There you go. You brought up homegrown terrorists and ISIS-inspired terrorists. What ability does the FBI have to actually investigate publicly available information that's posted online, specifically on various social media sites and Facebooks, et cetera, about individuals who would be terrorist sympathizers?
We do not, as a matter of course, just sit and sort of monitor social media. We do, however, in the context of specific properly predicated investigations, look at all available sources, including publicly available information, which could include the kinds of information that you're describing. So it's definitely true that social media becomes a major part of a lot of our terrorism investigations, but we don't really have the means or really the authority to just kind of sit and troll the social media looking for problems.
But if you have a case that you're working, do you have the authority to further those investigations?
Yes,
okay,
yes.
Good, all right. You mentioned also earlier in one of your responses about many terrorist investigations are linked also to immigration violations. I wanted to talk about the diversity visa. As you know, it has been reported that the suspect in a New York City attack on Halloween entered the U.S. on a diversity visa. In the course of the investigations, can you just talk a little bit more about the abuse of the immigration system, in particular visa security issues that are being exploited by subjects who are, or individuals who are the subjects of investigations? And are there changes to that process, that vetting, that you could recommend to us?
Well, I think most changes to the immigration or visa program are really better directed to the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State, which have the responsibility for those two aspects of enforcement. I think I can say this because it's public record in the charging documents, that in the New York attack, the individual in question, although he did come in through the diversity visa program, he radicalized, at least according to him, radicalized a little bit after he got here. In other words, he wasn't already radicalized when he came in, it would appear. Some of the visa concerns that we have going forward are as the caliphate collapses and as fighters from overseas fan out to other countries, they could well end up in countries, for example, visa waiver countries, and then end up in the U.S., right? So a lot of people worry, well, are they gonna, when the caliphate falls, all come, to the U.S.? Another scenario that's a little more worrisome and maybe a little more likely is that they flee Syria or Iraq and go to some other country, some third country, and are there for a while and then come into the U.S. maybe a year from now, 18 months from now, 2 years from now, and that's something that concerns us.
Okay, great, thank you. And my time is out. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Director. Thank you for being here. And I know this has been touched on a couple of times, and I just want to reiterate something that I hear regularly from my constituents in South Texas, and that's a concern. We have a special counsel investigating the Trump administration, but it seems like no one is addressing the Clinton administration. I know the chairman touched on this, as did some of the other questions. And I really don't have a question here other than to reiterate that it is a pretty strong concern of a lot of the folks that I represent, and I know y'all don't comment on whether or not there is an ongoing investigation or is not, but as we start seeing the results of the special counsel's investigations coming to fruition with publicly announced indictments and the like, if there are investigations going on with the FBI, and I hope they are, the time is getting right to see some results for that. And I think the other piece of that is a lot of my constituents say it's not fair. We have a special counsel investigating one side and not the other. So I just put that out there. Now that I'm finished on my soapbox, I do want to talk a little bit about Section 702. During our DOJ oversight hearing a couple weeks ago with the Attorney General, he indicated the DOJ finds it problematic to require a warrant from the FISC court before accessing or disseminating contents of communications that aren't related to foreign intelligence. And I have a great deal of respect for Attorney General Sessions, but I have to say I wasn't totally satisfied with the answer to this question. So I want to ask you, again, is it fair to say that requiring a court order to view content in limited circumstances after a 702 database was queried specifically to return evidence of a crime dismantles the 702 program, a national security tool designed to protect us from terrorists, not common criminals?
Congressman, the dismantles language, I think, comes from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence response to the bill, and that is the intelligence community's view about the bill in its totality, all the different changes, not just the querying part of it that you referred to, but some of the others. We do believe very strongly that we are using the tool lawfully and appropriately. That has been consistently found by the courts that have looked at the issue and by the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board and by all the different oversight mechanisms that have existed. We do believe that starting to, when there is no constitutional requirement to do so, and that is, in my mind, quite clear, that adding additional burdens and hoops for agents to jump through at that really early stage, that's when 702 is so important, is at the very early stage when tips are coming in, we are getting flooded with leads and we're trying to evaluate, is this a lead that is something that is important? It may come in, it may turn out to be foreign intelligence information, it may turn out to be some other kind of crime. At that point, we don't know, and all we want to be able to do is query, which is running a database check of information that we have already constitutionally in our possession.
Again, my concern is I understand the need to protect us from crime, but the Fourth Amendment is in the Constitution for a reason, and I have a great deal of respect for that. On a similar note, I've introduced legislation criminalizing improper unmasking. It's actually called the Wrongful Unmasking Prevention Act, which establishes a penalty of 10 years imprisonment for anyone who knowingly makes an unmasking request for any reason other than to understand foreign intelligence information, to assess the importance of foreign intelligence information, or to determine whether classified information is evidence of a crime which has been, is being, or is about to be committed. The idea behind this is you don't want folks unmasking stuff for political purposes or to check up on their girlfriend or their neighbor or for some other improper reason. Now, obviously, this is just a bill, but from an agency perspective, does the FBI now investigate unmasking claims that might be improper?
There are situations where the request could lead to an investigation. Merely somebody making a request, an unmasking request, and having it denied, for example, would not be enough. But if we have evidence that somebody obtained, which would in that case, for example, be classified information for an improper purpose, that is something that we would investigate. A lot of times the unmasking concerns are linked to and less about the unmasking itself and more about, in my mind, a very serious issue, which is leaks of the information, whether it's through unmasking or something else. And that's something that we're trying to be very aggressive on. I think the department, the intelligence community, the FBI are open to working with you and the committee on the unmasking issue. I think ideally it would be separated from 702, which we think is an incredibly important tool.
That's why it's a separate piece of legislation. Yeah. I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for being here. Thanks for staying. As for those, sometimes we get here a little bit later and we go earlier, as many have left, but sometimes you get to stay to the end. I think it's been good today because there's something that you had said earlier. The chairman brought it up, and I just was one from Northeast Georgia. It's good to, be back. I know you traveled to Gainesville and Judge Kelly's court and everybody else up there for a while. But I think the interesting thing here is something that was said earlier, especially about when asking for stuff, and it was the determination. I'm not going to share that here. And I think the question is, I would just have a general question to start with. What is your belief, personal belief, and how much you have to cooperate with this committee?
My own view is that we should be trying to do everything to cooperate with this committee that we legally and appropriately can.
Okay. And because you come here, you're under oath, you're still under oath. It's something we take very seriously, but I've also been here 5 years. And some of the questions today, and I want to put in perspective because there's some things I just want to put for the record as we have a good relationship starting forward, because I think you bring a great breath of fresh air, hopefully, to this agency, as I believe. My dad was a state trooper. I come from a law enforcement background. We've got to have this trust. But just as a few years ago, right before I got here in July 6th of 2011, in a draft letter that was circulated within the Department of Justice, a department official, Faith Burton, wrote, "I'd stay away from the representation that will fully cooperate in the future." This was in dealing with Fast and Furious. So you've got to understand the members up here doing our constitutional job are sometimes skeptical of what has been said here. And I've had an interesting back and forth with the former Attorney General, with your former, the former FBI Director. So I just have a few questions, if we could. One, is it possibly, and recently there's been some problems, and I want to hear from you, of unprecedented leak of information about FISA wiretaps. We got into FISA a little bit ago. Specifically, there was a leak of information related to the FISA wiretap of Paul Manafort. Leaking information about FISA warrants is a felony, is it not?
I'm sorry, leaking information about FISA warrants?
FISA warrants is a felony, is it not?
Yes, I would think it would be.
What is the FBI currently doing to identify the leakers of that information?
Well, I'm not going to comment on or confirm or deny the existence of any specific investigation. I will say that when we have at the moment quite a number of active investigations into unauthorized disclosures of classified information. Is
it something you would say that you would put a high priority on? Finding out who leaks and holding them accountable?
I believe that finding out, I will say that I believe that finding out who has leaked classified information is something that's extremely important. I will say also, having been somebody who has had responsibility for a lot of leak investigations, not just now, but when I was the Assistant Attorney General and had both the Criminal Division and what's now the National Security Division, leak investigations are breathtakingly difficult to pursue.
Well, I think,
and so that does not mean we shouldn't pursue them. And in fact, I am a big believer in the idea that we should, even if we may be pessimistic about our ability ultimately to be able to find somebody charged, because the mere fact of conducting those investigations sends a strong signal that we will not tolerate people leaking classified information.
and I agree with that, and I think that needs to happen, because it's got to start with you, and if it doesn't start with you, and I think, frankly, there's not been that leadership in that department for a while. Well, let's go back to FISA, because earlier on there was a discussion that you it came across as we're not going to provide that or provide that in this setting, or we didn't have a right to that. So I just have a few questions. So what information or documents related to FISA do you think the FBI can withhold from the committee? Can they withhold FISA warrants?
Well, I think there's a couple different stages of cooperation here, right? So one is the question of what we can provide in an open setting, and then one is what we can provide, right?
Because I want to get down, because your time is valuable, mine. We'll just assume it's in the proper setting, proper format. But what I was concerned about was the way it was actually said earlier was there may be some issues. So if properly asked for a FISA warrant, is there any reason why you would withhold that information legally that you can?
There are situations where information related to a FISA application involves sensitive sources and methods that, in my experience, are not shared with committees of Congress.
Okay, information that has formed the basis for FISA warrant, or legal memorandum regarding FBI's interpretation of FISA.
Well, the FBI's legal interpretation of FISA, unless it's asking for attorney-client privilege information, I would think something we could discuss with the committee.
Again, I think that's the concern that I have. And looking at this is, as the chairman said earlier, and backing up the chairman, the jurisdiction of this committee on both sides. This has become one of the biggest issues that we have here. And I've been here on different committees asking different agencies under a Republican administration now and a Democrat administration, there's a belief that you can withhold from this oversight. And this is the primary, especially on FISA, is the primary. So I'll clear up the uncertainty you might have. The committee has the authority to demand any document or piece of information related to the FISA program. And there are many things that we would like to see and be a part of, and I think you've indicated your willingness to do that. We need to continue that openness in this thing. Otherwise, you're going to continue to have the discussions and innuendo and everything else, because at the end of the day, this is a problem. But my last question has one concern. You made a mention earlier, and I thought it was sort of interesting. You said that Mr. Strzok was not demoted or trying. I'm not sure, frankly, and this is just a good North Georgia boy looking at this. How do you take the #2 counterintelligence person who is on one of the highest profile in special investigative committees that's been in a long time in this town, and take him and put him in a random slot at Human Resources? Not offensive to Human Resources. They got a big job, but I don't think there was a pressing need for your #2 person here in counterintelligence, who was on the highest profile investigation going on this Hill, to all of a sudden say, you know, there's a big need in Human Resources. Let's move him over here. I have a bigger concern that if it's some of the issues that have fallen out with Mr. Strunk, why would you put him in Human Resources where he would have a oversight or even teaching responsibilities of what other agents would be a part of? I think you need to be careful, maybe just from an example part, of how we say that that wasn't a demotion or a transfer or something that did not have proper, at least on the appearance of what happened in this case. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Marino, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Director, it's good to see you again. It's always a pleasure.
Hey, Martha.
I got to tell you a little something. When I got out of high school, I didn't go right to college, but I wanted to be an FBI agent. So I got a job many, many years ago as a clerk at the Department of Justice. I was there for a short period of time until we found out that I was colorblind and would not make a very good agent if I couldn't tell the color of a car or the color of clothing. So I came back home and worked in a factory for a while. When I was a district attorney and a U.S. attorney, I was threatened a couple of times. And the FBI and the U.S. Marshals were right there to watch my back. But what was more important, they were there to watch my family during these threats. And I will never forget that, and I greatly appreciate it. I have the utmost faith in you and the Bureau. We are part of the same honorable profession. You and Jim Comey and I worked very well together. We got a lot of good work done. And the agents and the staff of the Middle District of Pennsylvania, that would be Harrisburg, Scranton, and Williamsport, They made me look good, and I appreciate that. I know how proffers work. I've used them many times. I know how immunity works. I know what a 302 report is and how that works. I'm not, let's put it this way, rarely, in my humble opinion, should we be using special or independent counsel. We know there's a strict criteria for that if there's a conflict. And the reason is because I trust the 99.9% of our agents, the scientists and staff, a bit more than I trust Congress. And I know you will follow the FBI and DOJ procedures regardless of what happened in the past. If you ever need anything from me, don't hesitate to call upon me. Thank you very much for your service, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Marino. I really enjoyed our time working in the department together, and I know you're committed to supporting law enforcement, and it's very much appreciated.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the gentlewoman from Alabama, Ms. Roby, for 5 minutes.
I thought I heard the chairman say since I was last I could go as long as I wanted to, but I won't. I will stick to the 5-minute rule. Thank you for your time spent with us today, and I appreciate you staying through the last vote series. Have you read the USA Liberty Act, which was our bill to renew Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act, which this committee approved 27-8 last month?
I wouldn't say I reviewed it word for word, but I have read through it.
Okay. And will you commit to working with this committee to reauthorize Section 702 in a way that protects Americans' civil liberties as well as our national security?
I'm absolutely committed, in fact, eager to work with the committee to try to make sure that we get 702 reauthorized in a way that's not only constitutional, but that also protects our national security. Obviously, as you've gathered from some of my responses, I have very clear and very specific views about what that is, and I have tried very hard in order to be responsive to this committee to really get into the weeds with the agents about how we actually use 702. I've actually sat at terminals with both kinds of agents, national security agents and criminal agents, in this role as director, rolling up my sleeves, looking at the screen, watching what happens when they tap the keyboard. So I feel like I have a pretty good handle on it, and I just implore the Congress to be really careful here, and I worry that we're heading down a road that we will all regret, and I just hope lives aren't put at risk as a result.
Well, I agree with you as well, but I just want to make sure that we can continue to work together, and I've heard you say that, so
yes,
thank you.
Thank you.
As you well know, we have an epidemic of human trafficking in this country, including the trafficking of children, and the internet plays a huge role in that. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act shields some websites from legal liability regarding content posted by their users. I have serious concerns about this. Under existing law, do you believe that legal action can be taken against websites that enable, and that's a key word, enable this horrible behavior?
Well, as I mentioned in some of the earlier questions in different contexts, I now consider myself a reformed lawyer, former lawyer almost. So I'd have to look closely at the law to study the law in this area. I will say that there are situations where we have been able to bring cases against what I would call third parties for aiding and abetting some of the issues that we're talking about here, payment processors, things like that. So maybe there's a scenario where that kind of approach would work. Certainly, I am deeply concerned, as I know you are, about human trafficking, especially with respect to kids, but not only kids. And as I mentioned in my opening, that's something that we are very aggressively pursuing. So I'd be happy to look at and then have somebody sit down with you.
Yeah, and I mean, we would welcome any of your thoughts or your recommendations on improving our laws. Of course, we have several bills in front of the Senate and the House today where we are, again, trying to balance making sure that those that are enabling this type of horrific behavior are held liable, but at the same time protecting innovation on the internet and the use of the internet. And so, but I think at the end of the day, what we all can agree on is that we've got to come up with a solution that works so that we can protect these precious young people and adults from being subjected to this type of abuse. So real quickly, given the decision by General Services Administrations to scrap plans for the new FBI headquarters, I'd be interested in your thoughts as to where we go from here. While the Obama administration requested $1.4 billion for the construction, Congress appropriated $523 million, leaving an $882 million funding gap. So the total cost of the proposed headquarters was a hefty $2.5 billion. And I understand that the existing building is in a state of disrepair. However, I'd be interested in your ideas about how to reduce cost.
Well, we are actively, when I say went back to the drawing board, we're considering all options. We are working very hard with GSA, and I think there's a report due to another committee in late January about some of our progress. We're looking not just at different building permutations and locations, but also at funding permutations, which I think could be a change maybe in the way we go about getting to a good answer, to try to look at how we might pay for it first and then see what flows from that, as opposed to the other way around. I will tell you that as somebody who's now spent 4 months back in the building, I remember the last time I was in the building in 2005, the place seemed like it was not in good shape then, and I can assure you it's not gotten better in the years that passed. So we do need to find a solution. I think the men and women of the FBI deserve a building that's in better shape than this one is, but I'm not ruling out any particular approach to that, but I do want to make sure we get an upgrade.
If the gentlewoman would yield, I completely agree with the director on that. We have some excellent real estate in Virginia that would purpose exceedingly well, just across the river.
Well, my time has expired, but I just want to take the opportunity to tell you and your family, thank you for your service to our country, but also all of the men and women who serve at the FBI. We really appreciate all the hard work that is done. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, and on behalf of the men and women of the Bureau and their families, we appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Roby. Director Wray, thank you very much. I do have one additional question. Have you personally seen any of the struck texts that we have been talking about here at length today?
Yes.
Can you characterize for us your impression of whether those do indeed constitute the kind of political going beyond just expressing an opinion, but political activism that does not befit an FBI agent?
Mr. Chairman, I really would prefer not to do that at this point. There is, because of the investigation that's ongoing, and it's also because of whatever might come out of that, I don't think it would be responsible for me to be offering an opinion at this stage.
I respect that. Let me just close by saying that I very much appreciate your testimony here today, not just that you're here for 5 hours, but that you have answered questions with a great deal of candor when you can, and I respect the fact that you can't answer all of our questions, particularly in a public setting regarding some ongoing investigations. However, I think that members of the committee have made it very clear that there are deep concerns about what has been happening at the FBI, not under your watch, but now under your responsibility to repair that reputation of what I truly think is the world's finest law enforcement organization. And that's going to take your testifying before committees and responding to various inquiries, but it's also going to take more than that. It's going to take some action. There are going to need to be some personnel changes. We've had a number of names in high-ranking positions at the Bureau mentioned in passing here without getting into tremendous details. And again, the Inspector General's investigation and the investigation being conducted by this committee will probably reveal more that needs to be done there. I also think that a renewed effort to be fully responsive and timely responsive to the inquiries of this committee and other committees, but particularly this committee, which has oversight responsibility, and in lieu of a second special counsel, is conducting an investigation that, if there were a special counsel, we would not feel the need to engage in that. We need to have the information that we're requesting, and we need it promptly. And we have no intention of interfering with the investigation being conducted by the Inspector General. In fact, we think his investigation is very important and very helpful, and we have been working with him in that regard. Those sorts of actions, and probably some changes in protocol regarding how agents conduct themselves and how they view some of the actions that have been revealed in the media and during the hearing today, do not reflect well on the department and create in the minds of many Americans a misimpression of how the overwhelming majority of FBI line agents and others conduct themselves. But because these people are in positions of great responsibility at the highest levels of the agency, I think that those who stay need to get some new protocols on how to represent the agency. Some need to go, and all of this needs to be made available to the appropriate committees that are investigating. I thank you very much, sir. If there's anything you'd like to add, we welcome it. With that, the hearing is concluded. And, oh, one more thing. We will be submitting additional questions in writing based upon some of the questions that members submitted and some issues that have come up that we think may be more suited to submitting questions to you in writing. We hope that you will answer those promptly as well. Again, I thank you for your participation. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record, and this hearing is adjourned.
And wrapping up the House Judiciary Committee hearing, getting testimony from FBI Director Christopher Wray. He was at the witness stand since 10 a.m. this morning when the hearing began.